In the deepest halls of every Space Marine fortress monastery, beneath layers of blessed stone and ancient steel, there exist chambers that most battle brothers will never enter. These are the crypts of the ancients, where massive sarcophagi stand in silent rows, their occupants suspended between life and death, between memory and oblivion. Within these armored tombs sleep warriors who walked alongside primarchs, who fought in the Great Crusade, who stood in the presence of the Emperor himself before the darkness of the Horus heresy tore the galaxy apart. These are the ancient dreadnoughts, living relics of an age that has passed into myth. You would think that such beings, warriors who have endured for 10,000 years or more, would be eager to share their memories of the master of mankind. You would imagine that chapters would wake these ancients regularly, gathering their battle brothers to hear tales of the Emperor's glory, to learn what it was like to stand before the greatest being humanity has ever produced. You would expect detailed accounts of his presence, his words, his radiant power that supposedly outshone the stars themselves. But here's the thing that should unsettle you, the detail that reveals one of the grimdark universe's most profound tragedies. When these ancient dreadnoughts are roused from their centuries-long slumber, when their systems hum back to life and their mechanical voices crackle through vox speakers, they don't speak of the Emperor. Not really. Not in any way that satisfies the desperate hunger for knowledge that drives their younger brothers to wake them. Oh, they might acknowledge that they saw him, that they fought in his presence, that they remember the Great Crusade. But ask them to describe what it felt like to stand before the master of mankind. Ask them to put into words the experience of being in the presence of the galaxy's most powerful psyker, and you'll find only silence. Or worse, you'll get vague platitudes, fragmentary impressions, words that feel hollow compared to the momentous nature of what they supposedly witnessed. This isn't because the Emperor's presence was unremarkable. Quite the opposite. Every account from those who stood before him during the Great Crusade speaks of an experience that defied human comprehension. The Emperor wasn't just a powerful psyker or a brilliant general. He was a psychic supernova, a being whose very existence warped reality around him. People saw him differently depending on their own nature, their own beliefs. To some, he appeared as a golden giant, radiant with power. To others, he seemed a simple man, unassuming and humble. Sisters of Silence, those psychic nulls whose very existence dampens the warp, saw him as he truly was, and even they couldn't fully articulate what they witnessed. So why can't the ancient dreadnoughts tell us about this? Why do these living links to humanity's greatest age remain frustratingly silent on the very subject that would matter most? The answer is as tragic as it is inevitable, and it reveals truths about the nature of dreadnought existence that the Imperium would prefer to keep buried beneath layers of ceremony and religious reverence. To understand why ancient dreadnoughts won't, or can't, describe the Emperor's presence, we first need to understand what it means to be a dreadnought. And I can promise you, it's nothing like the glorious eternal service that the chapter serfs whisper about in hushed, reverent tones. The transformation of a space marine into a dreadnought is not a reward. It's a desperate salvage operation performed on warriors too valuable to let die, but too broken to ever fight as they once did. When a battle brother suffers wounds so catastrophic that even the legendary resilience of Astartes' physiology can't save him, when his spine is shattered, his organs ruptured, his body reduced to barely living fragments, the apothecaries face a choice. They can grant him the Emperor's peace, extracting his gene seed so that his genetic legacy might live on in a future generation. Or they can condemn him to something that, depending on your perspective, is either a higher calling or a fate worse than death. The process begins with what remains of the warrior's body. And let's be clear about what that means. We're not talking about someone with a missing limb or even someone paralyzed from the neck down. The Space Marines who get interred in dreadnoughts are those whose bodies have been essentially destroyed. Their bones are pulverized, their organs are failing, their flesh is ruined beyond any hope of reconstruction, even with the advanced augmetics available to the Adeptus Astartes. What the tech marines and apothecaries are working with is essentially a brain, a few vital organs, and whatever scraps of flesh they can keep alive in an amniotic suspension. The surgery itself is described in the lore as brutally painful, so agonizing that even space marines, warriors who have been psychologically conditioned to withstand torture that would break normal humans in seconds, sometimes die from the sheer shock of it. They're cutting into a living brain, implanting neural connectors that will allow the warrior's consciousness to interface with a machine. They're stripping away everything that made him physically human, everything that connected him to the world through touch, through movement, through the simple act of breathing real air. The marine who enters this surgery is, in a very real sense, killed. What emerges is something else entirely. Imagine the moment of awakening. You were a warrior, a demigod of battle who could tear through enemy lines with chainsword and bolt pistol. You could feel the recoil of your weapons, the impact of your boots against solid ground, the way your armor moved with your body like a second skin. You had hands that could grip, eyes that could see unfiltered by technology, a voice that came from your own throat. Now, you're trapped in a metal coffin. Your hands are weapons you didn't choose. Your legs are hydraulic pistons. Your voice is a mechanical rasp filtered through vox speakers. Everything you experience comes to you through sensors and data feeds, translated by systems you don't fully understand into something your brain can process. The different patterns of Dreadnought offer varying levels of this nightmare. The Contemptor pattern, those ancient war machines from the Great Crusade and Horus Heresy era, were technological marvels. They featured atomantic shielding, sophisticated sensory systems, and neural interfaces that allowed for faster, more intuitive control. A Contemptor pilot could fight almost as naturally as he had when he possessed a biological body, his movements guided by instinct rather than conscious thought. But even these superior machines came at a cost. The technology required to maintain them has been lost, and the chapters that still possess Contemptors guard them jealously, knowing that every battle risks the permanent destruction of an irreplaceable relic. By the 41st millennium, most dreadnoughts are of the Castroferum pattern, the boxy angular war machines that have become iconic. These are cruder, less sophisticated than their predecessors. The sensory input is grainier, the movement less fluid, the connection between pilot and machine more obvious and jarring. And then there are patterns like the Leviathan, massive siege dreadnoughts that mount weapons powerful enough to level fortifications, but whose neural load is so intense that pilots risk madness with each deployment. But regardless of the pattern, regardless of how advanced or crude the technology, the fundamental horror remains the same. You are buried alive in a machine, your organic body reduced to little more than a biological processor, keeping a weapon system functional. The Imperium calls this an honor. The tech priests speak of it as the ultimate fusion of flesh and machine, the apotheosis of the Omnissiah's will. The chaplains frame it as eternal service to the Emperor, a chance to fight forever in his name. What they don't talk about, what the ceremonies and rituals are designed to obscure, is the price that this eternal service extracts from those who pay it. The psychological impact of dreadnought internment is something that the Imperium doesn't like to acknowledge, but it's there in every piece of lore if you know where to look. The isolation is total and crushing. Between battles, dreadnoughts are placed into stasis sleep, their consciousness effectively shut down to preserve both their sanity and the precious technology that keeps them alive. They close their eyes on one era and open them decades, sometimes centuries later, to find that everyone they knew is dust, that the chapter has evolved beyond recognition, that the galaxy has changed in ways they can barely comprehend. Each awakening is a fresh trauma. You have to relearn who you are, what you're fighting for, why you're still doing this when every fiber of what remains of your being screams for rest, for peace, for the final death that has been denied to you for so long. The younger Marines who gather around your sarcophagus see a legend, an ancient hero to be revered. You see strangers wearing the colors of your chapter, speaking your litanies, but feeling as alien as any Xenos. The world has moved on without you. Time has done what no enemy could. It has made you obsolete, a relic from an age that no longer exists except in fragmentary records and fading memory. And your memory, that's the cruelest part. Because human memory, even Astartes' memory enhanced by genetic engineering and hypno-conditioning, was never designed to function across centuries of subjective experience, interrupted by long periods of nothingness. Each time you wake, you remember a little less. The faces blur together. The names slip away. The specific details of battles you fought, worlds you conquered, brothers you served alongside, all of it begins to fade like a dream upon waking. What remains? The broad strokes, the major events, but stripped of emotional context. You know you fought at the Siege of Terror, but the fear you felt, the desperation, the hope, the rage, those feelings have been worn away by time and trauma. You remember that you stood before the Emperor, but what did that feel like? How did his presence affect you? What did you feel in that moment? The answers to those questions exist somewhere in the degrading organic matter that was once your brain, but they're locked behind walls of time and mechanical separation that grow higher and thicker with each passing century. Some dreadnoughts handle this better than others. There are accounts of ancient dreadnoughts who remain lucid and coherent even after millennia of service. But there are just as many stories of those who have slipped into madness, who wake screaming, who have to be restrained and reconditioned before they're fit for battle. And even those who maintain their sanity do so by a process that the lore describes in chilling terms. They forget. They let go of their humanity piece by piece, allowing the mechanical aspects of their existence to overtake what remains of their organic self. They become the weapon, because holding on to the memory of being a man is simply too painful to bear. This is the context we need to understand when we ask why ancient dreadnoughts won't describe the Emperor's presence. These aren't just old soldiers with fading memories. Their consciousness trapped in metal shells. Their organic brains slowly degrading over centuries. Their connection to their past lives eroding with each cycle of sleep and waking. They're suffering from a form of trauma that no human has ever experienced. A psychological burden that compounds over timescales that would break any mortal mind. But to fully grasp the tragedy here, we also need to understand what they're supposedly unable to describe. We need to talk about what the Emperor's presence actually was, according to those who experienced it and could still articulate the memory. The Emperor of mankind was not a normal being. This should be obvious, but it bears repeating because the sheer scale of his psychic power is difficult to convey without sounding absurd. He was, by all accounts, the most powerful human psyker to have ever existed. Some sources suggest he was actually a gestalt entity formed from the souls of ancient shamans who committed ritual suicide to create him. Others hint at a different origin entirely. But regardless of where he came from, what he became was something that transcended normal human existence by orders of magnitude that we struggle to comprehend. His psychic presence was so overwhelming that people literally saw him differently depending on their own nature. This wasn't an illusion in the traditional sense. It was reality itself, bending around the sheer gravitational pull of his psychic might. To baseline humans, he might appear as a god, radiating golden light, his every movement accompanied by what seemed like celestial music. To space marines and primarchs, those beings genetically engineered from his own material, he could appear in forms that matched their expectations or his purposes. To psychers, he was a sun in the warp, a psychic beacon so bright that it hurt to perceive him directly. But the Sisters of Silence, those rare women born as psychic blanks, nulls who exist outside the warp's influence, they saw something different. In the novel Master of Mankind, one sister describes seeing the Emperor during the war in the webway not as a golden god, but as a man. Just a man, sitting on the golden throne, his mouth open in a silent scream of agony, as he holds back the demonic hordes threatening to flood through Magnus's breach. No golden aura, no psychic corona, just a human being pushing himself past all conceivable limits to protect humanity from annihilation. Which version was real? Probably all of them. The Emperor existed on so many levels simultaneously, his consciousness operating across physical reality and the warp at the same time, that trying to perceive his true form was like trying to understand a four-dimensional object by looking at its three-dimensional shadow. You could see part of it, the part that your limited perspective allowed you to process, but you could never grasp the whole. And his presence, the actual experience of being near him, that was described in terms that suggest something beyond normal human experience. Primarchs, beings who were themselves demigods, described feeling small in his presence. Custodians, warriors who had been crafted specifically to serve at his side, spoke of his will as an almost physical force. Even corrupted beings, those who had fallen to chaos, recognized him as the anathema, the fundamental opposing force to everything they served. During the Great Crusade, when the Emperor still walked among his armies, being in his presence was reportedly transformative. He radiated certainty, purpose, an absolute conviction that humanity's future was bright and achievable. He could inspire courage in those gripped by fear, could calm rage with a word, could make even the most cynical warrior believe in the dream of a unified, enlightened human empire spanning the galaxy. His psychic influence wasn't just power, it was meaning itself, given form and purpose. This was what the ancient Dreadnoughts experienced. This was the presence they stood in, the aura they felt, the being they served during the Great Crusade. And this is what they cannot, or will not, adequately describe. Bjorn the Fell-Handed represents the perfect case study for this tragedy. He is the oldest loyal Space Marine dreadnought still in service, having been interred in his sarcophagus around 934 M31, making him over 10,000 years old by the current timeline. Before his interment, Bjorn fought alongside Leman Russ during the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy. He personally saw the Emperor. He was there during some of the most critical moments in the Imperium's history. He is, quite literally, a living link to the age when the Emperor still walked among his people. The Space Wolves wake Bjorn only in times of great need, or when they require his ancient wisdom. Every century or so, the ritual is performed. The Tech Marines prepare his sarcophagus. The rune priests chant their litanies, and the ancient warrior's consciousness is pulled back from whatever dreamless void he inhabits during his long sleeps. And when he wakes, his battle brothers gather to hear stories of the old days, of Leman Russ, of the Great Crusade, of the Emperor himself. But there's a detail in the lore that should haunt you. Bjorn is described as increasingly reluctant to tell these stories. Some sources even suggest he sometimes pretends to be more senile than he actually is, hoping his brothers will stop waking him, stop asking him to relive memories that have become more burden than treasure. When he does speak of the past, his accounts are factual, historical, stripped of the emotional weight that should accompany such monumental events. He'll tell you what happened, where it happened, who was there, but ask him what it felt like. Ask him to describe the presence of the Emperor or the majesty of the Great Crusade, and you get silence or vague generalities. Why? Because Bjorn has been in his sarcophagus for over 10 millennia. He has been asleep more than he's been awake. His organic brain has been sustaining his consciousness for longer than any human brain was ever meant to function. The memories are there, somewhere in the degrading neural pathways, but they're fading. More importantly, the emotional context that would make those memories meaningful has been eroded by centuries of isolation, trauma, and the slow, mechanical separation from his own humanity. Bjorn's sullen, bitter personality, mentioned in multiple sources, isn't just a character quirk. It's a trauma response. He's a warrior who has watched everyone he ever cared about die. He's been awake to witness his chapter evolve into something he barely recognizes, full of traditions and practices that would have seemed absurd to the space wolves of his era. He was left behind by Leman Russ, the Primarch he loved more than any other, left to guard the Fang without explanation, while Russ disappeared into the Eye of Terror on some quest that Bjorn still doesn't fully understand. And through it all, he's been trapped in a metal coffin, trotted out when his chapter needs his firepower or his memories, then put back to sleep when he's no longer useful. In one particularly telling passage, Bjorn is described as remembering not the glory of the Great Crusade or the majesty of fighting alongside Russ, but rather the howling of his younger brothers, the wolf-themed decorations they've plastered over everything, the way they've taken wolf and stuck it in front of half the armory's items. His memories of recent awakenings are clearer than his memories of the legendary campaigns he fought millennia ago. This isn't because those recent events are more important. It's because human memory, even enhanced Astartes memory, works on the principle of recency and emotional salience. The fresh experiences, even if they're trivial and annoying, are more accessible than the ancient ones, even if those ancient events were objectively more significant. And then there's the nature of the memories themselves. When Bjorn tries to recall specific moments from the Great Crusade, what he finds are not rich, detailed recollections, but rather fragmentary impressions. He knows he stood in the Emperor's presence. He has a sense that it was important, that it meant something. But the actual feeling, the qualia of that experience, has been lost to time. It's like trying to remember a dream from your childhood. You might recall that you had the dream, that it was significant, but the actual content has faded beyond recovery. This is compounded by the mechanical nature of his existence. Bjorn doesn't experience the world the way he used to. His sensory input comes through machine sensors, translated into signals his organic brain can process. His emotions, if he can still access them, are filtered through the psychological trauma of 10,000 years of half-life. The warrior who stood before the Emperor and felt his presence all those millennia ago is not the same being who now inhabits the Dreadnought chassis. That warrior died, piece by piece, over the centuries. What remains is something else, something that carries his memories like old files in a degrading archive, but can no longer access the emotional and experiential context that would make those memories truly meaningful. The memory degradation in Dreadnoughts is not just a matter of time passing. It's a specific, documented phenomenon that the Imperium understands but chooses to frame in religious rather than medical terms. The organic brain tissue that remains in a Dreadnought sarcophagus is subjected to conditions that no brain was meant to endure. Long periods of stasis sleep, where consciousness is effectively shut down, followed by sudden reactivation. Exposure to the neural load of interfacing with a war machine. The psychological trauma of isolation and loss compounding over centuries. The simple biological reality that organic matter degrades, and even Astartes' physiology has its limits. What happens, according to the law, is a gradual hollowing out of the personality. The first things to go are the emotional connections. You stop feeling the warmth of camaraderie you once shared with your battle brothers. The grief you felt at their deaths fades into abstract knowledge that they're gone. Love, fear, joy, rage, all the emotions that make us human begin to dull, to feel distant, as if they're happening to someone else. This is actually a mercy, in a way. If you could feel the full emotional weight of 10,000 years of loss, of endless war, of isolation beyond human comprehension, you would go mad. So the mind protects itself by disconnecting, by becoming cold. Next to go are the specific details. Faces blur together, names are forgotten. Entire campaigns merge into a general sense of, I fought there, without the specifics of who, what, when, or why. The memories that remain are those that have been reinforced through repetition, either through your own recollection or through being asked about them by others. This is why Dreadnoughts can often tell you about the major battles they fought, the legendary victories that are written in chapter histories. They've been asked about those events enough times that the memories have been kept alive through rehearsal. But the small moments, the personal experiences that don't fit into the official narrative, those slip away unremembered and unmourned. And finally, if a dreadnought survives long enough, their very identity begins to fragment. This is when they start to become the cautionary tales whispered about in the halls of the fortress monastery. These are the ancients who wake screaming, who don't recognize where or when they are, who have to be restrained and their neural interfaces recalibrated before they're fit for service. These are the ones who have lost the thread of who they were, their sense of self eroded by time and trauma until all that remains is rage or fear or simply a mechanical determination to keep fighting, because fighting is all they remember how to do. The Imperium has a term for dreadnoughts who remain lucid and coherent across the millennia. They're called venerable dreadnoughts, and they're treated with immense respect bordering on worship. But here's what the term really means. A venerable dreadnought is one who has managed to retain enough of his personality and memory to still function as a person rather than just a weapon system. It's not the standard outcome. It's the exception that proves how devastating the usual progression actually is. And even the venerable dreadnoughts, even those who are held up as examples of warriors whose spirit remains unbroken, even they are fighting a losing battle against entropy. Every awakening costs them something. Every century that passes sees more neural pathways degraded, more memories faded, more of their humanity slipping away into the mechanical efficiency that keeps them functional. This is the reality that the chaplains don't mention when they speak of dreadnought interment as an honor. This is what lies beneath the ceremonies and prayers and litanies. To be a dreadnought is to be slowly erased, to watch yourself disappear piece by piece over centuries while being denied the peace of true death. And the ancient dreadnoughts, those who have endured the longest, are those who have lost the most. So when we ask why they won't or can't describe the Emperor's presence, we're asking warriors who have been psychologically destroyed by their own supposed immortality to access memories from a time when they were still fully human, still fully themselves. We're asking them to articulate experiences that occurred before the slow erosion of their identity began, before the mechanical existence stripped away their capacity for deep emotional connection. We're asking the impossible. But there's another layer to this, something even darker that the lore hints at but never quite states outright. The Emperor's presence wasn't just psychically overwhelming, it was reality warping in its intensity. The experience of standing before him wasn't something that normal human cognition was equipped to process. It was, by multiple accounts, beyond words, beyond description, something that had to be experienced to be understood. Now imagine trying to hold on to that memory while your brain slowly degrades over 10,000 years. Imagine trying to put into words an experience that was already beyond words when it was fresh, now filtered through millennia of trauma and mechanical existence. Even if the dreadnought could access the memory fully, even if the emotional context hadn't been stripped away, how would they describe it? What language exists to convey standing in the presence of a being who existed simultaneously in physical reality and the warp, whose psychic might was so intense that it bent perception itself? They can't. That's the simple truth. Even if they wanted to, even if the memories were perfectly preserved, the experience they're being asked to describe is fundamentally ineffable. Add to that the degradation of memory, the loss of emotional context, the psychological damage of dreadnought existence, and what you get is silence. Not because they're being obstinate or secretive, but because they literally cannot bridge the gap between what they experienced and what they can communicate. There's also a protective element to this silence that shouldn't be overlooked. The ancient dreadnoughts have, over their long existence, learned that some memories are too painful to share, some truths too bitter for their younger brothers to accept. They remember the Emperor not as the distant god that the Imperium worships in the 41st millennium, but as a being they actually served, fought alongside, perhaps even conversed with. They remember the Great Crusade not as the mythical golden age of propaganda, but as it actually was, with all its contradictions and compromises. If Bjorn were to truly open up about his memories of the Emperor, what would he say? Would he describe the master of mankind's cold pragmatism, his willingness to commit genocide against human civilizations that refused compliance? Would he talk about the way the Emperor used his sons, the Primarchs, as tools rather than true children? Would he mention the Emperor's arrogance, his certainty that he alone knew the path forward for humanity, a certainty that ultimately led to the Horus heresy, when Horus and half the legions decided they'd had enough of being expendable pieces in their father's grand design? The Emperor that the ancient Dreadnoughts remember is not the God Emperor of the imperial cult. He was powerful beyond measure, yes, but he was also flawed, calculating, often cruel in his pursuit of what he believed was humanity's best interest. The presence they stood in was overwhelming not just because of its psychic intensity, but because of the sheer weight of purpose, of will, of absolute conviction that brooked no opposition and acknowledged no doubt. To speak honestly about that would be to undermine the foundation of the current Imperium. The God Emperor is the lie that holds the whole rotting edifice together. The idea that he was a perfect being, that his plan was flawless and betrayed by weak and treacherous sons, that everything would have been perfect if only everyone had remained loyal. This is what the ecclesiarchy teaches, what the common citizen believes. An ancient dreadnought who spoke truthfully about the Emperor as he actually was would be committing heresy against the state religion, would be tearing down the careful mythology that the Imperium has constructed over 10,000 years. So, they remain silent, not just because they can't access or articulate the memories, but because on some level, they understand that the truth would do more harm than good. Better to let the younger generation keep their illusions, keep their faith in the God Emperor. Better to be seen as senile or forgetful than to be the one who reveals that the foundation of their entire civilization is built on carefully curated lies. This protective silence is also evident in how ancient dreadnoughts interact with their chapters. They tell the stories that reinforce the chapter's values, that support its traditions, that help maintain cohesion and morale. But the darker truths, the uncomfortable realities, the memories that would challenge rather than comfort, those they keep to themselves. It's a kind of psychological triage. They've survived this long by knowing what to say and what to keep hidden. They've learned that sometimes the most important service they can provide is not the sharing of knowledge, but the preservation of necessary mysteries. There's also the matter of how the Imperium treats those who question too deeply. The Inquisition exists in part to suppress dangerous truths, to maintain the orthodoxy that keeps the Imperium functioning. An ancient dreadnought who started speaking too freely about the Emperor's true nature, about the realities of the Great Crusade, about the failures and flaws that led to the heresy, would quickly find themselves declared corrupted, possibly demonic in nature. They would be destroyed, their chassis dismantled, their organic remains burned, and their names struck from the chapter's records. Better to remain silent than to suffer such a fate. But beyond all these practical and psychological reasons for silence, there's something even more fundamental at play. The ancient dreadnoughts are, in a very real sense, ghosts. They're remnants of an age that no longer exists, warriors from a time when the galaxy was different, when humanity's future seemed bright and achievable. They've watched that dream die slowly over 10 millennia. They've seen the Imperium decay into the nightmare it's become, all the while knowing that they fought for something better, that the Emperor's vision, flawed as it was at least aimed at a future worth living in. To speak of the Emperor's presence, to truly convey what it was like to stand before him during the Great Crusade, would be to give voice to that loss. It would be to acknowledge just how far humanity has fallen, how completely the Emperor's dream has been corrupted and perverted. And for warriors who have sacrificed everything, who have endured 10,000 years of living death in service to the Imperium, that admission might be too much to bear. So they speak in platitudes if they speak at all. He was glorious. His presence was overwhelming. To serve in his sight was the greatest honor. These are safe answers, vague enough to satisfy, without revealing anything that might challenge the listener's faith or the speaker's sanity. The tragedy here runs deeper than just lost historical knowledge, though that's certainly part of it. The real tragedy is that the ancient dreadnoughts represent the last living connection to humanity's greatest age, and they're slowly disappearing. Not just physically, as the irreplaceable technology that keeps them alive gradually fails, but psychologically, as the memories and experiences that make them valuable erode into fragments and shadows. Every time an ancient dreadnought goes to sleep, there's a chance they won't wake again. Every time, they do wake. They're a little less than they were before. The knowledge they carry, the experiences they witnessed, the truths they know about the Emperor and the Great Crusade, all of it is fading away like writing on old paper exposed to harsh light. And when the last of them finally achieves the death they've been denied for so long, whole chapters of history will be lost forever. Imagine being there at the moment when the final ancient dreadnought from the Great Crusade era shuts down for the last time. In that instant, the last living being who actually saw the Emperor in his prime, who fought in his presence, who experienced what it was like to serve in an Imperium that still believed in its own future, will be gone. Everything after that point will be filtered through second-hand accounts, through written records that may or may not be accurate, through the mythologized version of events that the Imperium has created for its own purposes. This is already happening. The number of ancient dreadnoughts from the heresy era shrinks with each passing century. Bjorn might be the last one who actually fought in the Great Crusade, who saw the Emperor before the Golden Throne. The others have either been destroyed in battle, their irreplaceable chassis finally overwhelmed by enemies that their ancient honor wouldn't let them withdraw from, or they've simply failed to wake from their last sleep, their organic components finally giving out after millennia of service. And the knowledge they took with them is irreplaceable. The Imperium has extensive records from the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy, yes, but records can be falsified, edited, interpreted to support whatever narrative the current regime wants to push. The personal testimony of someone who was actually there, who experienced events firsthand, that's invaluable in a way that no written account can match. But personal testimony requires a living witness, and living witnesses are becoming extinct. This loss extends beyond just knowledge about the Emperor. The ancient dreadnoughts carry with them the culture of their time, the attitudes, the assumptions, the way warriors thought and fought during the Great Crusade. They remember chapter traditions before they became formalized and rigid. They knew the Primarchs not as mythical figures, but as actual commanders, with all their strengths and flaws. They experienced the optimism of the Great Crusade, the horror of the heresy, the desperate struggle of the Scouring. All of that lived experience is vanishing. What will the Imperium be like when the last living link to its founding era is gone? It will be a civilization entirely built on mythology, on stories and legends that may bear little resemblance to the truth. The Emperor will be a god in the complete sense, his actual nature unknown and unknowable. The Great Crusade will be a fairy tale of perfect unity and glorious conquest. The Horus Heresy will be simplified into a morality play about loyalty and betrayal. All the complexity, all the nuance, all the human reality of those events will be lost. And perhaps that's what the Imperium wants. Perhaps the ancient dreadnoughts' inability or unwillingness to speak clearly about the past is actually serving a purpose. The Imperium of the 41st millennium doesn't need complicated truths. It needs simple, powerful myths that can unite 1 trillion souls across 1 million worlds. It needs the God Emperor, not the man. It needs the glory of the Great Crusade, not its atrocities. It needs heroes and villains, not complex human beings making difficult choices in impossible situations. In this light, the silence of the ancient dreadnoughts becomes almost protective. By not speaking, by not revealing the full truth about the Emperor and the age they lived through, they're allowing the Imperium to maintain the mythology it needs to survive. They're letting their younger brothers keep their faith, their purpose, their belief that they're fighting for something worthy and true. The ancient warriors understand that sometimes the best service they can provide is to take their uncomfortable truths to the grave. But this protective silence comes at a personal cost that's almost impossible to calculate. To be one of the ancient dreadnoughts is to be a keeper of secrets that no one wants to hear, a living repository of history that everyone would prefer remain mythologized. It's to watch as the events you lived through are rewritten into propaganda, as the being you served is transformed into a god you wouldn't recognize, as the Imperium you fought to build becomes something that would horrify the warrior you once were. And you can't speak about it, even if you wanted to, even if you had perfect recall of every moment. You couldn't articulate the truth without being branded a heretic. You're trapped not just in your sarcophagus, but in a conspiracy of silence, a tacit agreement that some things are better left unsaid. There are other warriors from the Great Crusade era who remain, of course. The Custodian Guard, the Emperor's personal bodyguards, still stand vigil in the Imperial Palace. Unlike Space Marine dreadnoughts, the Custodians don't suffer the same degree of memory degradation. Their genecraft is different, more stable, more perfect. A custodian who walked the palace during the Great Crusade might still possess clear, intact memories of those days. But the custodians don't speak either. Their silence comes from a different place, not memory loss or trauma, but rather a deliberate choice. The 10,000 guard the Emperor's secrets as fiercely as they guard his physical form. What they know about the master of mankind, about his true nature and plans, they keep locked away behind walls of discipline and duty. They're not trying to remember, they're actively choosing not to share. This creates an interesting parallel. The ancient dreadnoughts can't speak about the Emperor because they've lost the capacity to do so. The custodians won't speak because they've been charged with preserving his mysteries. Either way, the result is the same: silence. The two groups who have the best knowledge of what the Emperor was truly like during the Great Crusade, who could answer the questions that burn in the hearts of every loyal servant of the Imperium, both refuse to satisfy that hunger for knowledge. Is this deliberate? Did the Emperor, in his foresight, somehow arrange for his true nature to remain mysterious? Did he understand that a god must remain distant, unknowable, beyond the comprehension of his worshippers? Or is this just an accident of history, the result of memory degradation and institutional secrecy combining to create an information gap that serves the Imperium's purposes? We can't know. That's the fundamental frustration at the heart of this whole question. The Emperor himself is beyond our reach, a corpse on a golden throne, his mind engaged in battles within the warp that we can barely imagine. The beings who knew him best are either silent by choice or by necessity. And so we're left with scraps, with fragmentary accounts, with stories that contradict each other, and myths that serve narrative purposes rather than historical truth. The ancient dreadnoughts watch this play out from their crypts. They see the pilgrims who come to Terra, who weep at the sight of the golden throne, who believe they're in the presence of a living god. They hear the sermons of the ecclesiarchy, the prayers of the faithful, the battle cries of crusaders heading off to die in the God Emperor's name. And they know it's all based on a version of the Emperor that's been crafted, refined, and perfected over 10,000 years of propaganda and religious fervor. Do they regret their silence? Do they wish they could speak, could share the truth, could give humanity a more honest understanding of the being it worships? Or are they relieved that their failing memories provide an excuse not to tear down the comfortable lies? The lore doesn't tell us, Because the ancient dreadnoughts themselves won't tell us. They're locked in their metal tombs, locked in their degrading minds, locked in a conspiracy of silence that may be protection or may be prison. What we do know is that with each passing century, the possibility of learning the truth diminishes. The ancient dreadnoughts are dying. The custodians remain silent. The emperor himself is beyond communication. The window for understanding what it was truly like to stand in his presence during the Great Crusade is closing, may have already closed, and when it shuts completely, all we'll have left are the myths and the silences, the stories we tell ourselves, and the questions that will never be answered. This is perhaps the most grim-dark aspect of the entire situation. In a universe where there is only war, where billions die every day in service to an empire that grinds them to dust, where hope is a liability and ignorance is strength, the greatest tragedy might be that we're losing the truth about our own history. The beings who could tell us what we're really fighting for, what the emperor actually wanted, what his presence actually felt like, they're taking those answers to their graves. And maybe that's appropriate. Maybe in a universe this dark, this brutal, this committed to suffering as a virtue, the truth about our gods is something we can't afford to know. Maybe the ancient dreadnoughts, in their silence, are doing us one final service, protecting us from revelations that would shatter the faith that keeps the Imperium functioning. Or maybe they're just broken old warriors who have forgotten more than we'll ever know, trapped in machines that keep them alive long past the point where death would have been kinder, their silence less a choice than an inevitability, born of 10,000 years of trauma and decay. Either way, when you ask an ancient dreadnought to describe the Emperor's presence, you're asking someone who is no longer fully human to articulate an experience that was never fully comprehensible to begin with, filtered through 10 millennia of mechanical existence and psychological devastation. That they can't or won't answer shouldn't surprise us. What should haunt us is what that silence represents: the slow death of history, the victory of mythology over truth, the final erasure of the last witnesses to humanity's greatest and most terrible age. The crypts of the ancient dreadnoughts will one day be empty. The last sarcophagus will go dark. Its organic inhabitant finally allowed the rest that was denied for so long. And when that happens, the last living being who could have told us what it felt like to stand before the Emperor of mankind will be gone. All we'll have left are the stories, the propaganda, the carefully constructed myths that the Imperium needs to survive. And maybe, in the darkness of those empty crypts, in the silence where ancient voices once spoke of glories now forgotten, we'll finally understand the true cost of immortality, the real price of eternal service. The ancient dreadnoughts gave everything to the Emperor and the Imperium: their bodies, their lives, their sanity, their memories, their very humanity, all of it sacrificed in service to a dream that died 10,000 years ago. They can't tell us what the Emperor's presence felt like because they've forgotten how to feel anything at all. They won't tell us because the truth would destroy the faith that gives meaning to their endless suffering. And so they remain silent, these ghosts in machines, these witnesses to a history that's being erased, even as they struggle to remember it. That silence is the sound of the 41st millennium. It's the absence where understanding should be, where truth should live, where humanity's greatest age should be preserved and honored rather than mythologized and distorted. It's the empty echo of questions that will never be answered, of knowledge that's been lost, of a connection to our past that's been severed by time and trauma, and the sheer grinding brutality of a universe that values service over truth. So the next time you encounter a story about an ancient dreadnought, the next time you read about Bjorn the Fell-Handed refusing to share his memories, or an unnamed ancient speaking in vague platitudes about the glory of the Great Crusade, remember what that silence represents. Remember what's been lost, what's being lost, what will be lost when the last of these ancient warriors finally achieves the peace of true death. Remember that in the grim darkness of the far future, even our heroes are forgotten. Even our gods remain mysterious. Even those who gave everything in service to the Emperor cannot tell us what it was like to stand in his presence. That silence, that absence, that forgetting might be the most terrifying thing in all of Warhammer 40,000, because it means that we're fighting for something we can never truly understand, following a god whose nature is forever beyond our grasp, building an empire on foundations that are already crumbling into myth and legend. The ancient Dreadnoughts know this. They've watched it happen over 10,000 years. They've felt it in their own degrading minds, in their fading memories, in the slow erosion of everything that once made them who they were. And they can't warn us, can't share that knowledge, because the capacity to do so has been destroyed by the very immortality that was supposed to preserve them. That's the ultimate tragedy. Not just that they can't describe the Emperor's presence, but that their inability to do so is itself evidence of how completely the dream has died, how thoroughly the light has gone out. They are living proof that eternal service is eternal suffering, that immortality is a curse, that the price of serving the Emperor for 10,000 years is the loss of everything that would make that service meaningful. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of Warhammer 40k's darkest truths, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There's so much more to explore in the grim darkness of the far future, and I'll be here, bringing you the lore that makes this universe so compelling, so terrible, and so utterly unforgettable. The Emperor protects, but the ancient Dreadnoughts remember what he was protecting us from, even if they can no longer tell us about it.